The world of camera lenses is inherently confusing because there are just so many options that do so many different things at so many different price points. Like, do you want a wide lens? Do you want a telephoto lens? Do you want a prime lens? Do you want a zoom lens? Do you want a fast lens with a wide aperture? So many things to consider. And the reason I say that is because when I bought my first DSLR back in 2007, I only cared about the camera. I didn't care about the lens at all. It came with an 18 to 55 millimeter Canon kit lens. It was a Rebel XT was the camera. And I heard people talking about their different lenses and how expensive they were. And I thought it seemed insane to spend as much or more on a camera lens that you would spend on the actual camera. I thought, if I have this 18 to 55, obviously I don't need a 50 millimeter lens or a 35 or a 24 or a 20 millimeter lens because I have all those just built right into the zoom range. Aren't I so much smarter than everyone else who's buying, $1,500 prime lens? Turns out I was wrong, and there's a reason that there are more specialized camera lenses and lenses perform very differently. And that's also why certain lenses are more expensive than others. And the reason that I say this is because I'm about to talk about a $700 lens as if it's a budget-friendly option, fully understanding that $700 is a lot of money. That's as much as I spent on that first camera after saving up for like a year. But in the world of camera lenses, and especially full-frame lenses, $700 is on the lower end. And it is a bit more budget friendly when you start comparing what this lens, the Tamron 20-40 f2.8 can do versus a lot of others. So that's what we're gonna get into because I made a review on the Tamron 20-40 2.8 lens when it was released over a year and a half ago at this point. And since then, it's become one of my favorite and most used lenses, but it feels like I never hear anyone talk about this thing. And with everything that it can do for that MSRP of $699, I think it's worth talking about, and I kind of just want to remind everyone that this lens exists. So this is definitely not a full tech breakdown in any type way, but more of a practical, how does it perform? And how do I use it? How could you use it? Type thing. This is not a sponsored video. I pre-ordered this lens as soon as it was announced because I was so excited about it, and it is my first Tamron lens. And I think it's worth considering if you're in the market for an ultra practical lens. So hopefully by the time we're done with this, you won't think I'm wrong about the Tamron. All right. Next section, what does the lens not have? It doesn't have buttons. Just no buttons on this thing right here. It does not have manual aperture, which I know a lot of lenses don't, but if you're comparing this to a lot of Sony's GM lenses and a lot of the newer Sigma lenses, those do have manual aperture rings that you can click in, which is very cool. And it doesn't have any customizable buttons or anything like that. After using this lens for as long as I have, the one that I miss the most is the focus switch. I do wish there were a manual focus switch on here. I've just set a custom button on the back of all my cameras to switch between manual and autofocus, so I just use that. It's not really an issue, but sometimes it's just nice to be able to flip that physical switch and know that I'm locked down into autofocus or manual focus. But when we're talking about focus switches, let's now switch our focus to talk about the lens's build quality and different features, which I kind of talked about this in my more recent video about switching to Sony from Canon, but the build quality on this lens is great. Now, it's not on par with the Canon L series lens, which to me is like the gold standard of lens build quality and design. But it is on par with other non-white Sony GM lenses. When you get into like the Sony 70 to 200s, the lenses that are white in color, those seem to have a next level of build quality. But the Sony GM lenses that look kind of like this, just the regular camera looking lenses, this has the same level of build quality as those do. It does say that it's moisture resistant. I don't know what level, I don't know exactly when moisture becomes wetness, but it doesn't say that it's fully weatherproof. I haven't had any issues in the last 18 plus months. I do live in the desert, so for me it's mostly exposed to extreme heat, not extreme wetness, but I have taken it in the rain, I have taken it into the snow, and it's been no problem in any of those situations, but I haven't had it in like a hurricane or a blizzard or anything like that. So use common sense when, it's not an underwater lens, let's put it that way. It does have a minimum focusing distance of 6.7 inches, which is pretty great. Wide lenses do tend to have closer minimum focusing distance, which is very nice. My 85 millimeter lens, for example, I have to get like on the other end of a football field before I can focus in on anything because it's got such a long minimum focusing distance. So that's something that's incredibly helpful, especially if you're someone like me who maybe needs to use it to do close-ups of things a lot. It works incredibly well. The Tamron does have super fast and super quiet autofocus. Basically, I've noticed this has the exact same autofocus performance as my Sony 24mm GM does, which when that lens works, I've had issues with it, but when the autofocus works is phenomenal. It's not only just super sharp and accurate, but it doesn't hunt a lot. It is very smooth and very quick, and it doesn't make any sound. So that means even if you have a microphone mounted directly on your camera, you're not going to be picking up any lens noise. That's definitely an issue I've had in the past with other lenses. And fortunately with the Tamron, it's just dead silent. So even a mic super close to the lens, not gonna pick up any autofocusing sound. And it's at this point too that it's probably worth noting that Sony, the company, is the largest shareholder in Tamron. So if you've ever wondered why Tamron tends to make lenses with weird focal ranges like 20 to 40 that don't really overlap with the focal ranges of Sony lenses, I think maybe that kind of answers the question. But the reason I bring that up is because it also makes me wonder how much, or if any, of the manufacturing at all is shared between the two. Because like I said, the build quality and the autofocus are so similar between the Sony and the Tamron that it just makes me wonder if it is the same systems and the same materials. And finally, the last thing to mention, we talked about design and build quality. While there are no buttons, there is a zoom and a focus ring. It does have an external zoom, so the lens moves out just a little bit when you zoom it. And then the focus is all internal, so the lens doesn't move in or out when you focus. You don't have a window or anything on here, but you just have marks to see where your zoom focal range, focal length is. And these rings feel great. I've used them at beaches and stuff. They've gotten dust around them, but nothing has gotten in there to make them all crunchy and funky and gross or anything. So it still works great. And there is also a USB-C port on the side here if you need to do firmware updates, because we live in the future where lenses need firmware updates. And that is a thing. You don't need another dock or anything. So all that being said, let's talk about how I've been using this lens. I call it an everyday lens. For me, it can be more specialized. It can do really cool things. But for me, it's the lens that I just put on my camera when I need something that's super versatile. I don't want to take something that's the most expensive lens that I own, and I want to be able to just handle any situation that I encounter. And so it works incredibly well for those everyday situations. Anything that's sort of like vloggy or home movies or just for fun, that kind of stuff, it works incredibly well. I was trying for this video, I was like, oh, I'll go back and find all of the cool places I've gone and the stuff I filmed with this lens over the past year and a half. And there's not a lot of like beautiful cinematic things that I've filmed with it. I'll add some here just to kind of show you, yes, it can take very beautiful photos, and yes, it can take very beautiful video as well, but I've just been using it so practically. Pretty much every video on my second channel since I got this has been filmed with this lens because it is just so easy. I can do a talking head, I can show something, I can do a quick montage. I never have to take it off the camera. It's incredibly versatile. None of that is like, wow, look at this filmmaker over here, but it does exactly what I need to do when I need to do it incredibly well, and I use that a lot. I do use it as a second angle quite a bit, so sometimes if I don't have a camera like this where it's kind of this is a 50mm lens, if I want a wider second angle and I want to be able to show more, I use this a lot on that. And I've also used it as a primary, an A camera lens several times as well when the thing I'm talking about or sharing just is a little bit bigger and takes up more of the frame and I need more than my standard 24mm has to offer. I mentioned my 85mm lens a little while ago, and this complements that incredibly well because the 85 can really zoom in on details and blur out the background, and then this at 20mm can go so wide that then I can get totally a different feel, which is really fun for product B-roll, especially on cameras like the FX3 or the A7S III that have 120 FPS, 4K 120, where then I don't even need a slider or stabilizer or anything. I can just do handheld B-roll shots. This lens works so good for things like that. It is an f2.8 lens, which is definitely not as fast as my f1.4 or my f1.8. I love those sub 2.0 f-stop lenses. But a 2.8 lens, a 2.8 zoom lens, constant aperture, so that means it can be 2.8 at any of these focal lengths. for $700 I've never really heard of that before. It does work well indoors, not necessarily low light. Like if you're in a dark, moody place, it's probably not the best lens for that. But if you're filming indoors, and especially if you can, control some kind of lighting or add in some kind of lighting, it's gonna do great. And of course, outdoors, it's gonna be phenomenal as well. You can get some decent background blur, although you can kind of cheat that because if you crank it to 40, then you're at a more telephoto focal length and it will kind of compress and blur out the background a little bit more easily. But my favorite thing to do, you might have guessed, is to pair this lens like a fine wine and a fine cheese with this Sony a7 IV. This is my absolute favorite all around for everything camera setup. Oh, and then put the little Sony mic on here. So there's no cables. This is the ECM B1M. It's the bigger Sony shotgun mic. I love these. Did a whole video about them, but because they don't need any cables and they still have all these awesome controls, so you get great audio out of this mic. It's multi-directional as well. I have this camera, which is a really good photo and a really good video camera. I've talked about that before. It does not have 4K 120, unfortunately. It does have 4K 60, which works really well. And the thing that I really love for this is it has super 35mm crop. So that means now my 20 to 40mm lens, if you crop it 1.6-ish, now has a lot more reach than you would normally expect. So I can give you an example real quick. Here is the lens at 20mm. It's pretty darn wide. And if I zoom into 40mm, that's what that looks like. It compresses the background, but that's how wide it goes. What I've done with the a7 IV is I've just set this button here. If I press it, now I go into super 35mm crop mode. And now this is 20mm and this is 40mm. What's 40 times 1.6? So that means my 40mm lens now becomes sort of a 64mm lens. It gives me a lot more reach. And if you're shooting with a camera that has high resolution, you could potentially crop in a little bit. Or if you're using one of the Sonys that has clear image zoom, and that means it will digitally zoom in just a little bit more, but without degrading the image quality, you can kind of see where now this 20 to 40mm lens does a lot more. And the reason that that's important, I put Fuego over here. The reason that that's important is because it is such a small, lightweight lens. My Canon 24 to 105, it's nice to have 105 zoom length. This is a bigger, heavier lens. And that's the thing you kind of notice when you're talking about 2.8 zoom lenses is they tend to be very big and very heavy. So you can kind of see here, especially once I take off the lens hood, it's pretty small and compact and pretty lightweight. And for everything that this camera setup can do, the versatility that's right in here, I don't really know that there's a setup that would be more versatile. Even on my recent trip to NAB, which I've talked about in several other videos, I brought a bunch of other lenses, but I ended up literally only using this on my FX3 the whole time. I never took it off the camera because it worked so well, and the shooting conditions at NAB varied so much. Like in the convention hall, some things were super bright, some things were super dark, it was crowded, and the lens just got some absolutely stellar looking shots and was great for interviews, and it was nice to be able to dial in, zooming in, being wide, whatever we needed, we could do it at any point in time. So it handled anything I threw at it. But while I can sit here and tell you how great this lens is, it's probably important to also talk about some alternatives, because I think that's any reasonable person, right, is gonna go, okay, that lens seems awesome. Let me go do some shopping. What about these other ones? I think the first alternative, and the one I was choosing between when I was deciding if I should buy this or another one, was the Tamron 17 to 70 2.8, which is the exact same price. And why wouldn't you get a little more on the wide, you get a little more on the zoom, you get the same 2.8 at the same price. Why not just go for that lens? The reason being, it's an APS-C lens. So if you have a full frame camera like I do, it's just not a choice for you, which was great because it made the decision-making process much easier. If you have an APS-C camera, a crop sensor camera, this lens will work on it. So will the 17 to 70. You might as well just get the 17 to 70 unless you want the smaller lens. It is a little bit bigger than this, but you get 30 extra millimeters, so why not, right? Another alternative, maybe kind of more in line with what I'm talking about, an everyday 2.8 zoom lens, would be the Sony 16 to 35 f2.8. Because 16, that's kind of the most common vlogging style lens, everyday focal range, 16 to 35. And it is a really great lens, but it also has an MSRP of $2,300. So personally, I find having the extra reach for 40 millimeters to be more useful on full frame than the extra width of 16 millimeters. But I know lots of other people want as wide of a lens as possible, so that's where the 16 might win out. The thing to point out though is that lens, which I don't have, but I have used, is not $1,600 better in any universe than this lens. There's no world where I could argue get the 16 to 35 over this, unless you really, I don't know. No, let's say if you need focus breathing compensation, but honestly, that $1,600 is enough that you would save as enough compensation for me. Another alternative would be the Sigma 24 to 70 2.8. 24 to 70, you're not getting that wide end. And while personally, I don't notice much of a difference between 16 and 20 millimeters in terms of wideness, it's easy to hold and, point at you or other people, get everything in the frame. 24 millimeters suddenly becomes pretty difficult unless you have really long, orangutan selfie stick arms. 24 millimeters a little tight for vlogging. 70 millimeters, super helpful, and 2.8 of course is great like we've talked about, but that Sigma lens, depending on which version you get, is over $1,000. So an amazing lens. I love Sigma lenses. They are great, but more expensive, not necessarily as good for everyday stuff, especially if you're doing anything vlog style. It is also significantly bigger and heavier, which again, at least for me, isn't ideal for everyday use. When you have to think, I'm gonna go take my camera somewhere and it's gonna be big and heavy and annoying, you tend to take your camera less. When it's light and compact and super versatile, I don't feel bad grabbing this, using it, taking it places, even if I never end up really using it. At least I had it, you never know. And so if we're talking about Sigma lenses, should also talk about what is maybe a closer-ish one to this, which would be the Sigma 16 to 26 2.8 lens. That has an MSRP of $840. Now again, I love Sigma lenses, and I think that one's very reasonably priced, but that is a weird focal range. Maxing out at 26 millimeters, 16 to 26, it's not much more than just a prime lens would be. So being able to go all the way to 40, from 26 to 40 instead, to me makes the Tamron a clear winner over the Sigma. It's cheaper and I feel significantly more versatile. So to wrap things up, I don't know why this lens, at least to me, seems like it's overlooked. The only thing I can think of is that maybe on its surface it doesn't seem that exciting. It's just a third-party, kind of general focal length, sort of doesn't specialize in anything lens. But in my eyes, that lack of specialize is what makes it special, because when you combine price, features, and performance, it's easily the best lens value I've ever used. I mean, that goes from Canon and Sony. It just doesn't get any better than this. And the more you use it, the more its practical nature will shine. So maybe, a video review or a written review might not, do people still do blog posts about lenses? It might not shine in the same way it will when it's actually on your camera, in your hands, and you're using it. So at least for me, the more I use this lens, what I notice is it kind of gets out of the way and lets me capture the images and the video that I want. And speaking of things that I want to capture your attention right now to say thank you to everyone who helps support my channel through Patreon and YouTube channel memberships. And if you want to know more in a more traditional style review of the Tamron 20 to 40, check out this video right here. I also got videos about other lenses too, if you want to focus on those.